Huh. I gotta say, I am just really enjoying new Age of Sigmar books. I mean, it's not the same as fantasy, but they are a lot of fun to read. Sometimes there's some, sometimes there's just some really cool little things. Like the lore itself is good, but sometimes there's also some like fun things to come. I mean, the Fireslayer book had some really cool hints about like Chaos Dwarfs and all that stuff, which is so fascinating because I bet that's gonna have a part to play in Warhammer the Old World and Total War, but there's not like there's anything in this book that could do that. I mean, unless they talk about Chaos Dwarfs in the ocean, but I mean, just unfortunately, there's not a lot here that could really be used in fantasy, like sea elves or some silly thing. And oh, okay, they've updated the timeline and too bad. We could use a forbidden horrors. Mere decades after their great exodus, the Ideneth wage a terrible war against the abyss-dwelling horrors known only as the Abholons, or Chasm Dwellers, for dominion over the deepest oceans. Though the deep can triumph, many Sithai are lost. All mention of these nightmarish foes is suppressed and forbidden. I mean, that 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 could no no that's ridiculous. That couldn't be. I mean, maybe it could. Theoretically, it. No, it's just a. It's. Fish people. Hello, everyone. Loremaster Sotek here, and it's been a hot minute, hasn't it? I apologize for my absence from the YouTube sphere. I hope y'all have been enjoying the various streams and stuff, and of course the Lord Beards podcast that have been appearing. I have been struggling and dealing with a lot of health issues over the past few months, mostly revolving around my stomach ulcer, and then I got COVID on top of that, and I've been dealing with some other stuff, so I've just been kind of having a... Grandfather Nurgle has been laying it on thick, to say the least. But I'm slowly but surely starting to do better. I'm still dealing with these things, and not every day is a great day, but I'm having more good days than I am having bad days now. So hopefully that's a good sign, and things will just continue to get better. But it is come time for me to get over here and start putting out videos again as best I can. I have some finished scripts that I just need to record now, which is super exciting. So hopefully you're looking forward to that. One of them includes my Total War Warhammer 3 review, which is going to be pretty long, but I've been adding thoughts to it as things have been happening, but that's enough on future stuff. I just wanted to just briefly explain where I've been. I hope you're all doing well. It's lovely to see you, but get out your tinfoil hats and put them on. It's time. Get out your thinking helmets, your thinking caps, because we've got a new theory here, and I really think that just like the prior tinfoil cap here theories, when it came to Be'lakor, Prince Yuri, Boris Ursus, Grand Cathay, and those things all, of course, now existing and being in the Total War Warhammer series, I think it's time to aim my hat at the tabletop and the lore, and maybe even future Total War Warhammer 3 content. And this is, of course, to talk about what I call the deep ones. Games Workshop has now officially given them a name, which is the Chasm Dwellers in the new Idoneth and Army book. Granted, it's a very, very brief mention, but one of the things that's been really cool about Age of Sigmar and why I keep up with the books is that from the lore standpoint, they tend to seed things pretty far in advance. And there's always just little whispers about things. And then they gradually increase in the amount they're talked about before they're suddenly released onto the setting. And I read it out in the little goofy start, but on page 18 of this book, we have mention of the Forbidden Horrors, which mention the Abholons or the Chasm Dwellers, which are a terrifying nautical race that the Idoneth Deepkin had to fight during the Age of Myth in order to claim their undersea homes. And apparently they barely won the war, and they lost many of the Sithai in the process, which the Sithai are the demigod level fighters among the Idoneth Deepkin. There's only one still alive at this point, being High King Volturnus himself. The rest of them have been wiped out over the years. But enough about AOS lore. Talk about just the deep ones in general. So if you're not familiar with the concept, I'm going to take this off now. The deep ones are not a myth in fantasy. They really do exist. I like to meme about them very, very hard, but we have a considerable amount of evidence about them and even some direct battles. And I want to dedicate some time today to talk about why this update in Age of Sigmar is important, and then what we might be looking at fantasy. So first of all, when it comes to Age of Sigmar and fantasy, a lot of people, I think, look at one or the other in a negative lens, or like to think they're not connected, but ultimately they are. It's not a secret that if you play Age of Sigmar, you can absolutely use your fantasy army very easily. You don't even have to rebase your army these days. You can literally just take your fantasy army, find a rule set, either using those exact same models with their exact same names, or in some cases subbing them for something that exists in the game, and you can just buy circle bases that have little squares cut out of them and just put your guys right in there. That's what I do with my Lizardmen. I have a Carnosaur mini right up there that is on his classic Warhammer Fantasy base. I used him as a Krokgar and a couple of other Old Blood and all that stuff. And for him, he's literally just on a square base, and I just insert it into his circle. So there is a lot of overlap between Fantasy and Age of Sigmar already. But something that has been happening a lot is that Games Workshop has very obviously been building up to Warhammer the Old World. We know it's coming. We know it's coming soon. I don't know how soon is. We don't know if we're looking at soon as in 2 years from now. Soon is 1 year from now. Soon is this year. Yeah, I think any of those are viable. We know that the Horus Heresy just got announced, so I would be surprised if it was this year, unless it ends up being like a big Christmas release. Because I imagine Horus Heresy is going to release is going to be the big summer release. But in any event, there is no question. There is no question that there is going to be a massive amount of model overlap between Age of Sigmar and fantasy. It's just unavoidable. It's gonna happen. That's a good thing. That's a great thing. But that is what we're looking at, is that Games Workshop has intentionally been designing many of the Age of Sigmar models so that they will fit on fantasy-sized bases, and then you will be able to use them in fantasy. We know fantasy is going to be on square bases. I don't think it's going to be the exact same scale that it was the old days. I think it's going to go up a little bit for each of the categories so that the models don't have to be as stiff and monopose as they did in old fantasy. So I'm expecting that, for instance, all the 20mm bases are going to go to 25mm bases, but you can see that with all the models. Like when they released the new Soulblight Gravelords, which are basically the vampire counts, all of the models that would have any possible use in fantasy, classic fantasy, still fit on the exact same base size. So the zombies, vampires, Blood Knight, like, and they're keeping a lot of these models around and updating them. The new White King, the new Graveguard, the new Skeleton Warriors. Actually, I think the Graveguard are still old, but the new Skeleton Warriors, a lot of them just look fantastic. The Chaos armies are very similar, where we have things that will translate so hilariously well into fantasy, and they fit very nicely on the base size you would expect. For instance, the Blissbarb archers of Slaanesh fit very nicely on 20-25 millimeter bases. The same can be said for many of the elite units, such as the the Putrid Blight Kings were on 40 millimeter bases, and they kind of featured as like super chosen. And now we have like Puscoil Blight Lords, I think, which are the Putrid Blight Kings on. That every single thing in AOS is going to translate into fantasy? No, I don't. I think certain things will be left in AOS exclusively, and certain things will be left in fantasy exclusively. Most notably, special characters. You know, you're not going to see Archaon in his Age of Sigmar form, where Dorgar is a giant three-headed dragon, and his model is just absolutely titanic, being allowed in fantasy. I think there's going to be a Asvar cool model that's going to be different. You know, maybe you could run Archaon as like a Chaos Lord on a dragon, but I don't think I don't think we're gonna see Archaon in the old world anytime in remotely, like, in the next decade. But if we ever did, I think he'd be like more for his classic design. But in any event, I think a lot of the armies are gonna have overlap, because that's just more sales for GW. Because some people will be too lazy to bother with having like bases that can interchange. So like either magnetizing their models so they can move them from base to base, or just going pure square bases and then buying circle bases that you can fit the square bases into, because circles are always larger, at least when you're dealing with AOS versus fantasy. So in that end, you know, a lot of people are going to be too lazy to do that. So you're probably going to be buying like twice as many models, so you can have one army for fantasy and one army for AOS. So it's just good business. But this is super exciting, because you may think, Sotek, you're jumping at shadows. Like, why that's a lot of build up. Talk about the fish people. So the reason I bring all that up is we know for a fact, an undeniable fact, that Chaos Dwarfs are coming probably this year. We don't know if they're coming this year or next year, but I would be shocked if the big Chaos book, because there is a big Chaos book coming out. I think they're going to announce it probably next month or the month after. We know there's a big Chaos update coming out. We don't know who it's for, but I suspect it is the Chaos Dwarfs. At the very least, are going to be the next Chaos race. Because they're definitely going to want to drop some new races in 3rd edition. The only new race we've gotten so far is a sub-race, being the Cruel Boys for the Orcs, who very likely are going to be the half-orcs that they've mentioned in Warhammer the Old World, because they look like what we would call half-orcs. But anyway, the Chaos Dwarfs have been mentioned in AOS forever. You can go back to, I don't know if they were in 1st edition, but they definitely were in 1st edition. You can go back to the very beginning of AOS and find mentions of the Chaos Dwarfs, and they have been building up all this time, and now it's just ridiculous, to the point where I just read through the new Idoneth Deepkin book and the new Fireslayer book, which came out about a week or two ago, and the Fireslayer book has a lot of mentions about the Chaos Dwarfs. Like, they're not even mentioned as like a mysterious force anymore, they're just out and about. And they featured also very prominently in 2nd edition and some of the campaigns, most notably the Wrath of the Everchosen supplement, where we had the forces of death invade the 8 points, and they actually attack one of the foundries of Archaon, where he produces all of his weapons and armor, and it's run by the Chaos Dwarfs. So Lady Olander and Orphean Catacros have this big fight against the Chaos Dwarfs. And in the same book, Archaon invades Ulgish, which is the realm between the realm of Shadow and Light, where Slaanesh was kept imprisoned, and he fights the Lumineth Realm Lords before the Lumineth Realm Lords were revealed as a race. So, like, we knew they existed, but we hadn't seen them in any form yet. And Archaon fights and kills a bunch of them, and then they ended up coming out after that book, like being released into the game. So that's how they do things in AOS. Sometimes, like in the case of the Cruel Boys, the race will just sort of like come out of nowhere. But a lot of the time, especially when it's a full new race, there is considerable buildup over time to hint away at some of these things and then reveal them with a whole bunch of, fireworks. And just like the Lumineth Realm Lords were hinted at and then released, and just like the Chaos Dwarfs have been heavily rumored and talked about and now released, I think the exact same thing is going to happen for the Fish People, also known as the Chasm Dwellers. They are a race that I highly suspect is going to come out in Age of Sigmar, probably for destruction, to really spice things up and get us away from just pure greenskins. Really give a new exciting take on destruction. I don't think they're going to be death or chaos. I think they're going to be other, because while they're talked about as being horrifying creatures, they very notably seem to have really battled against the Idoneth in ages before chaos showed up in any notable fashion other than just beastmen. But so with Chaos Dwarfs coming to Age of Sigmar, I think it is very likely that the Chaos Dwarfs will be revealed around the time-ish that they're going to show off Warhammer the Old World, and that you're going to be able to play Chaos Dwarfs in both settings using the exact same army. You'll just change the bases, and maybe they'll have exclusive characters for each one if they want to do that. But I think that I genuinely, deeply, non-jokingly think that this is a reveal of the Deep Ones for Fantasy and Age of Sigmar. Now, I don't think it's coming anytime soon. I think this is very far in the future, at least, 1 or 2 years, if not longer. But, if this is true, and the Abneroth, or whatever they're called, the Chasm Dwellers, are indeed coming to Age of Sigmar, therefore are indeed coming to Fantasy, that could very well mean they're coming Total War Warhammer. And I might get, literally everything I wanted. Because, come on! The Deep Ones, these Fishmen, have existed in Fantasy for ages. Many editions ago. There have always been some sort of nightmarish aquatic creatures that have been talked about for just so many editions. And they only got more and more and more information as the setting continued forward. And I've talked about this a little bit. I did kind of a very lore-focused, fluffy video. If you go back, if you go to my channel and go to my playlist, you can find a playlist called The Monsters Arcanum, where I talk about a bunch of random creatures. But it's in a very narrative format. And the very last video is about the Deep Ones. Though there was actually 1 or 2 things I missed. Surprisingly, even though I managed to get a lot of information in there, I still missed some stuff, shockingly. Probably the most notable of which was Lokir Felhard's battle against them. But they are a race that's been around for a long time, and just to give you a spiel of what we'd be looking at. So in Fantasy, the Fishmen are essentially an aquatic empire that they're not all over the ocean. They're in very specific parts of the ocean. They seem to be located much more heavily in the New World and not the Old World. We don't really have any stories of them coming up and attacking the Empire or Norsca or anything like that. There are sea monsters over there, but we don't have a ton of stories about the Fishmen actually coming up on land. Generally speaking, they tend to attack boats and lost vessels. We do have a ton of stories from the Dark Elves about them. The Dark Elves have a notable amount of tales of ships going out, and when they're in open water, so they're somewhere between the New World and the Old World, they get attacked by these creatures, and any ship that gets attacked by them always loses, because they're ambush predators, but they're not monsters. They're an actual civilization. They have technology, they have weapons, they use tactics, and they'll use these One of the most bizarre things that they have that's actually talked about quite extensively is that they are said to have this creature. We know it, I'm not exactly sure what it is, but it's kind of described as being like an octopus, so not a kraken, but it's a tentacled monster that wears a hard shell. And the deep ones, the Chasm Dwellers, somehow developed a method of turning their shells into some sort of like hollow vessel. So it could be that they're krakens that just have like fortresses built onto them as opposed to being like natural shells. But supposedly not only can they come out of these things, but they grab people and drag them into these vessels so that they can be kept alive when they're taken back down underwater. And the way they would attack ships is that these creatures would come up and grab onto the bottom of the ship so it couldn't move, and then these creatures would swarm up. And what we know about them is they're described as like pale troglodyte creatures. So they're vaguely humanoid, they're extremely pale, and they're said to have disgusting mouths that are just full of rows upon rows of like shark teeth. So they're terrifying. But they wield weapons, like they have like spears and swords and nets and tridents and stuff. And we know that they can hold their own in massive battles. The one time we really get to see them in a huge fight where like we know for it wasn't just like, oh, somebody, there was a rumor somebody fought them, but like there's just a flat out brawl, is Lokir Fellheart. That's where he got his helmet. If you wonder, why the hell does Lokir Fellheart start in Chup down in Lustria? Like, that's such a weird place for him in Mortal Empires. And the Vortex, it's actually not. And the reason is because that's where the fish people were. At least, that's where, like, one of the main hubs of their empire is. And he went to war with them there. That's where Lokir Fellheart got the Kraken helm, that spooky helmet of his. That by wearing it, it allows him to regenerate and makes him much more survivable. But it also seems to have genuinely made him less human. It seems to have altered his nature, and he's very spooky because of it. But he claimed that from them. There's a story in the 7th edition, I believe, Dark Elves book, where you literally get to read about how Lokir Fellheart fights he basically takes the Tower of the Blessed Dread. So he has a full blackguard at his command. He goes down near Chup, which is complete, that entire shelf, that most of the island that Chup was situated on slid into a trench at the bottom of the ocean. So it's not like you can see it, like it's super far down there. And he had all of the sorceresses on his vessel cast this huge spell that basically was a ritual that caused Lokir and his army to get covered in like a big bubble so that they could breathe and move underwater. And they end up basically walking their way down into this trench where there is a city of these nightmarish creatures that have like krakens and all these indescribable horrors of the sea. And there's this big battle breaks out between them and Lokir Fellheart. And Lokir, thanks to having a huge army behind him from an entire black art, he manages to win, but it's like a genuinely difficult battle, fighting in this pitch black hell where, the Dark Elves are having to use copious amounts of sorcery to not only keep themselves from being drowned and just crushed by the ocean's pressure, but also to be able to see. And they catch the Chasm Dwellers off guard by, attacking them directly, because that never happens. But he wins and manages to loot the Kraken helm as they run away. But there's always been these little tidbits about who they are. We have myths and legends about, or not necessarily myths, but like we know for a fact that there is an ancient civilization that lived below Nagaroth, because the continent of Nagaroth, which is like North America, and much of Lustria, which is like South America, is interwoven by these underground, titanic underground caves, which is known, oh gosh, what is it called? It's called like the oh, I can't remember what the name of it is. It's like the Dark Way or there's a name for it, but it's not important. But there's these tunnels, and that's actually how the Dark Elves can invade Lustria. They can't go over land because it's way too difficult because of the Grey Guardians, which is the mountain range, Massamundi range, raised. But there's this terrifying tunnel network that connects both of those continents, and the Dark Elves know for a fact that there is a civilization that lived down there that's gone. So, despite the fact that most of these areas are deep underwater and they're directly connected to the ocean, and the Umbral Way, that's what it's called. No, the Umbral Tide was the name of the Black Ark that went through it. Whatever, like I said, it doesn't matter. So, the Dark Elves have attempted to map out this system, but it's so complex and so large that they have failed to map it all out. And it's noted by the Dark Elves that there are certain portions of it they can't go into because it's too dangerous. There are things that lurk in the dark and under the water that will come up and just obliterate someone that tries to come through there and murder them all. So it seems that this is kind of one of those primordial races of the Warhammer Fantasy world that existed before the old ones. You know, they were there during the time of dragons and the time of, you know, back when the world was Pangea and all the stuff, before the old ones showed up and started mixing everything up. And it's very likely that when, you know, the continents started getting separated and the old ones were unleashing their will on the planet, that this race may have retreated deep into the oceans to where the old ones wouldn't notice them, because the old ones literally waged wars of extinction against the various natural races of the Warhammer planet, because the old ones decided that they were not suitable for the Great Plan. So a countless amount of races were completely wiped out by legions of Saurus, which is kind of messed up, but what are you gonna do? So if this is one of those primordial species, one of the original species, and they fled into the deep ocean, that would make a lot of sense. We know they're very capable of magic. We know they're very capable of technology. We don't know exactly how sophisticated their tech is, but we know they have some technology. Not technology in like the Skaven sense of the word, but you know, they're a civilization, what I'm trying to say. They're not just nameless creatures. And one of the things that I found very interesting in my research about them is that they seem to have had a dramatic impact on various events in the world. The most notable of which was the destruction of Chipiodal, which the destruction of Chipiodal is fascinating and very ill-explained, in that after the Great Vortex was created, I think it was a few thousand years later, it wasn't very long after, but at some point in the Lizardman timeline, after they'd beaten the demons, but before the Lizardmen caused the realignment of the continents that caused the fall of the Dwarf Empire. So this was before the War of Vengeance between the Dwarves and the High Elves. There was a earthquake that hit Lustria, and it was isolated to Lustria, and it has only happened once. So it's not like it was like a reoccurring event, and it's not like it's something that is talked about in any other timeline for any other race. But it was this big earthquake that caused a tsunami. So this big like the rumbling happens, everything's pretty much okay, and then the ocean recedes, and the Slann, too late, realize what's going to happen, and say, oh, you know, we have to get the hell out of here. So they order an evacuation of the city, and the entire city, like this entire temple city of Lizardmen that survived the war against the demons, so like it's a powerful city, starts evacuating. And despite the fact they evacuated and were miles away from the city, there was no way they were going to make it, because the tsunami that ended up coming in was so massive. It towered over the temple city. So we're talking about tsunami that was, you know, dozens and dozens of meters high, and it not only you know, obliterated the city, but it it flattened the continent of Lustria for miles inland, and completely obliterated all of the Lizardmen attempting to evacuate. even all the Slaanesh of that city, like combining their might, they didn't stand a chance against that level of force. It was too sudden, and they just there was nothing they could do. So the city is completely wiped out, and with the force of the tsunami, it breaks the shelf, that tectonic shelf that the city of Chapiotl was sitting on, and the entire thing slides down into the ocean and goes all the way down to the deepest, darkest depths, where it comes to rest at the bottom of this massive chasm. It's one of the deepest places in the oceans of the Warhammer world, and the Lizardmen know that there is something down there that has moved in. There is some force that took over the ruins of Chapiotl and claimed it for themselves and added it to their empire. And honestly, the more I look at that story, the more I feel that it's a deliberate, maybe not deliberate, but it's a very, in a way that the Warhammer likes to tell stories, it seems to me very likely that the Chasm Dwellers are the ones that caused this earthquake. They used some kind of ritual, some kind of device that they created to cause an earthquake in the ocean. They caused a tsunami and then claimed the spoils and got revenge against the children of the Old Ones once the Lizardmen were not in a position to be able to deal with them. Because the Lizardmen at their height, a tsunami would have been no big deal. Like, before the war against the demons, when, you know, things were chill and the geomantic web was at its full power and everything, a tsunami, that would have been, you know, easy. Super easy to deal with. But immediately after the Great Incursion, when the Slaanesh were, for the most part, very lethargic, because a lot of them had been cursed by Tzeentch, and the geomantic web had been shattered in many places, and the Slaanesh, like, were just trying to get everything reestablished and had very little idea what was going on, and the old ones were gone, and everything was just a damn mess. That's when this new race, or not new, but this new opponent strikes. I don't think it's a coincidence. So we have all this lore and this information about this mysterious race. And I really, really think that when we look at Warhammer the Old World, we know that Games Workshop is leaning hard into bringing back some really old stuff. I mean, they've already confirmed that, you know, they're bringing back the Hobgoblin Khanate, and it's like mentioned and flat out on the map as a major force in the world. And they've talked about bringing back Hobhounds, whatever the hell those end up being, which are presumably like some sort of wolf species or some kind of, like, you know, what squigs are to goblins, maybe Hobhounds are to hobgoblins. But then we have mentions of the centaurs returning. And the centaurs are very old lore, but we know that they're a benevolent race. I have found a single quote regarding the centaurs in a 6th edition publication, which I'll be talking about in the near future. And literally all it says is, when it's talking about the centaurs, it makes reference that the centaurs are not they're not true centauroids, and they're centauroids, but they are not a centaur. The book very explicitly mentions that the centaurs are a very distinct species from the centaurs, which are, like, it basically just calls them the benevolent centaurs, apparently being a good guy race. And of course, we've also heard about half-orcs, which I presume are just going to be a new species of greenskin that are like halfway between a goblin and an orc. So a little more orc. So, like, if a hobgoblin is somewhere between a goblin and an orc, but it's on the goblin side of the equation, I would imagine a half-orc is a goblin-orc mix, but it's on the orc side of the equation, if that makes sense. And the many of the Cruel Boys, which are the new Orc War Clan faction, would fit perfectly to fit that role, because they literally just look like orcs that are a bit more goblin-y. And many of their models would be perfectly at home in Warhammer Fantasy. Some of their models are a little, I think, too AOS-y for fantasy, but many of them would fit just fine. And I don't think that's an accident. I really don't. So this was a very long-winded way of me just wanting to share my excitement that I legitimately think, I mean, once again, you know, hat on, but I legitimately believe, with or without this thing, that these Chasm Dwellers, these deep ones, these forbidden horrors from the deep are coming to Warhammer Fantasy, these Abholons. So I just wanted to share that with y'all. I thought that would be a really fun topic. Let me know what you think down in the comment section. Are you throwing on your hats with me? Are you in? Do you think I'm being ridiculous? Do you think that's just kind of a cute Easter egg and it's nothing? Another thing, actually, that I want to talk about real quick is that a lot of people forget that we literally had a rule in 8th edition for the fish people that never got used because, and I'm not saying this because like I know this for a fact, but like it's the only thing that makes sense is that Games Workshop must have had plans for a fish people race that got canceled once they decided to do 8th edition. Or the end times, because a ton of plans got canceled. Like 8th edition was the busiest edition ever of Warhammer Fantasy. We got the Storm of Magic, we got the Monstrous Arcanum, we got Tarmacon, and the thing about like Tarmacon and the Monstrous Arcanum in particular is that they were the first of their series. Tarmacon in the book, it very explicitly is one of 4 books, but it got canceled after the first one because they decided to do the end times because they were assholes. And so we never got the last 3 books. And the Monstrous Arcanum was supposed to be a new series, which is why when you look at a Monstrous Arcanum book, as I will show you, there's a 1 right here. There's a 1 on the back. And when you open the book and you read like the foreword and stuff, it talks about that this book is very explicitly the first of a series. There were supposed to be many of these. And it was supposed to be a renaissance for Warhammer Fantasy and monsters. And Forge World handled the release of the Chaos Dwarf race, who we knew were getting more content in Warhammer Fantasy because they created Shartor the Executioner, who was a Bull Centaur special character that didn't get his book. So they just sort of like released him without a book to go with him. He just kind of like came out one day. Despite the fact that fantasy was dead. Just like what happened with the Giant River Troll Hag and the Squid Gaba, which were also 2 models that did not come out with a book. They just kind of came out because the books they were supposed to be in got canceled. I believe deeply that there was a fish people design for 8th edition because in the 8th edition core rulebook, we had a special rule called a sea monster. And the sea monster rule talked about how if you have a monster with this rule, then when it is on the battlefield, if it makes a move and it's moving over a non-aquatic feature, so it's not moving over a river or a lake or a swamp or a marsh, then it would move at half speed. And it never ever got used, which that's suspicious. That is very suspicious. But anyway, that's the end of my tirade and my theory crafting on that. Let me know what y'all think down in the comment section. I would love to know if you think I'm crazy and I'm leaping at shadows and that's literally just like a stupid little Easter egg, or if you think that I may be onto something. And if you do think I'm onto something, here's what I really want to ask you. So most of the Warhammer Fantasy races, good and evil, are inspired by real life cultures. So they usually take a famous culture at a particular point in their history and use that as inspiration to give that race, a lot of its identity, which I think is one of the big strengths of Warhammer Fantasy. So if we were to get fish people, what like nation, including its like time period and stuff, culture would y'all want them to draw upon for their creation? Like, obviously, I think they'd probably be very heavily pulling from things like Lovecraft, who, although is known for cosmic horror, I think can also be kind of pointed at as a master of nautical horror, because the dude realized that the ocean is gross. It's super scary. But like, I would love to know what mythologies or cultures or particular ideas you think would be like perfect to help create this race. And maybe we can talk about that again in the future. But thank you all so much for watching. Tons of stuff to come soon. I appreciate you all and hope you haven't missed me too much. Hopefully you missed me a little bit, but I'm trying to get stuff out again. So thank you all so much for watching, and I'll see you next time. Bye-bye. Thank you so much, everyone, for watching today's video. I hope you enjoyed it. I do want to give a special shout out to all of my patrons. Thank you all very much for supporting me over on Patreon, especially during these long gaps when I'm working on getting projects out. I hope you all are all looking forward to as these continue to come out. And I do want to give a special shout out, of course, to the higher tier lads: Eric, Sign of the Emperor, Bulwarg, Ekardir Thalion, Hologam, and Johnny Odinson. I very, very much appreciate everyone, of course, on Patreon, but especially you gents. You're all my heroes. Thank you very, very much for all the support. And I do also want to shout out the artist who made the wonderful, wonderful image of the Deep One, or Chasm Dweller, or Abholon. If you want to see more of his work, or maybe commission him for yourself, I will have links in the description down below. Be sure to check him out and thank him for his amazing work on this piece. But in any event, thank you all so much for watching, and I will see you in the next video. Bye.